Wait, nobody's on until we start. Good morning, everyone, and welcome so much to the Creating Fellowship Programs for Educational Institutions, a webinar hosted by Immigrants Rising. We're so excited to have all of you join us today. My name is Nancy Jeditis, and I work as the Director of Higher Education here at Immigrants Rising, and I'm excited to say that almost 200 people registered today from more than 20 states, coming from a mix of individuals from two-year public universities, private universities, community-based organizations, four-year public and private organizations, and then a number of you who serve of these different populations. We also have a couple of high schools who are participating today. So I'm really excited to share this great information. We also have a couple of other co-presenters, which you'll hear about in a few minutes, but I just want to welcome all of you today, let you know that we are recording today's video so that this will be shared with you at a later time. And we're super excited to let you know about some of the work that we've been developing here at Immigrants Rising. So we are, I do work with Immigrants Rising, and we work on transforming lives through education. And we are definitely looking today to talk more about how we can create professional development and educational opportunities for all students. So I'm really excited for the work that we've been doing collectively here at my organization. And to just give you a quick overview, or to remind you, for those of you that haven't seen it yet, Immigrants Rising recently released the Creating Fellowship Programs for Educational Institutions, and you can download this resource on our Immigrants Rising website at the really easy link to remember, which is immigrantsrising.org/fellowships4ed. That's immigrantsrising.org, fellowships for ed. In terms of giving a quick overview of what we're going to be doing today, we'll be giving introductions. We're going to be talking about why fellowships are important, talk about an overview of fellowships overall, and then really talking about how we can define and design inclusive fellowships. We'll then be going through the steps that we think are important in terms of creating inclusive fellowships, and we'll share with you a sample announcement, go over a quick sample announcement and agreement. And I'm really excited that we're also going to be able to hear testimonies directly from colleges and universities that have already implemented this plan. We'll then have time for question and answers. We are asking you to put your questions and answers on the chat box, and we'll be working with you to answer those at a time that we can appropriately answer those questions. So I'm going to pass it over now to my amazing colleague, Catherine Jin, and she's going to go over some of the different introductions.
Hi everyone, great to be on this webinar with everyone. We're so excited about this work. We have, as Nancy said, been thinking about fellowships for a long time, using fellowships ourselves as a mechanism to be able to support students, and we're just thrilled to be able to get this information out to a broader audience. So again, we are part of Immigrants Rising. Immigrants Rising empowers undocumented young people to achieve educational and career goals through personal, institutional, and policy transformation. We are excited here for the possibility to think about fellowships in the context of both personal transformation, the power of students to be able to transform their lives through fellowships, as well as for institutions, many of you on this call, to be able to support in that transformation by creating policies at your institutions to enable that. So Nancy and I are the main presenters here. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Immigrants Rising. And as Nancy said, she's the director of higher education. We want to give a shout out to Sam Park, who has been our legal policy associate for the past year here at Immigrants Rising, and his work in doing the research, legal research about fellowships for actually over a year before he even joined our organization has been absolutely essential to creating this document and the information you're going to hear today. We are also going to be joined by three partners from two different institutions, Oscar Turan, Marta Morales Hernandez, and Rosa Salamanca, and you'll hear from them at the end of this presentation. So I'm going to get into the meat of our presentation. So first, talking about why fellowships are important and why we think they're a mechanism that should be of interest to those of you who are on this webinar. So First and foremost, we see them as a way to support the educational and professional development of all students, regardless of immigration status or work authorization. I'll note that not all fellowships are accessible to all students, regardless of immigration status or work authorization, but they are a potential way, and we're going to show you how fellowships can be constructed in an inclusive manner that does make them accessible to all students, regardless of immigration or work authorization. It's important to note that fellowships can provide a stipend or a sum of money to aid in the pursuit of study or research. Those of us who work closely with low-income, first-generation college students are very aware that any educational opportunity outside the classroom often needs to be accompanied by the ability for students to be able to support themselves in order for that opportunity to be accessible and meaningful for them. So those are two reasons why we think fellowships are important and relevant to our work. And so I'm going to give an overview of fellowships now. So first of all, fellowships are generally short-term opportunities. I'll say short-term can mean can vary. They can range from a few months to even several years. They are, as I said, to support the educational and professional development of students. In this case, if you are at an educational institution, potential activities that they can support. And again, this is potential that you should in no way feel limited by them. We provide these as examples, but can be study in a specific field, research to advance work on a particular issue, design and development of a new community-based organization or initiative, training to support a fellow's growth, or opportunities to further explore a particular field or work. I think you'll notice in all of those that there is the idea of training, research, development, and things that will be of benefit to the student's education or profession. Fellowships can be created by various entities, which include, but are not limited to, educational institutions. The resource that we shared and this webinar is designed specifically for educational institutions. But again, fellowships are not limited to educational institutions. It's important to note that public charities and private foundations can also create fellowships, and that might actually be a more viable method for some of you on this phone call or webinar. We have a separate resource for you, and that's called our Overview of Grants to Individuals. Fellowships are a subset of grants to individuals, so in that document we include scholarships and fellowships, and you can find that at immigrantsrising.org/grants to individuals/. Again, please check out both of those resources if you're not, or both of these resources if you're not sure which entity would be creating this fellowship. As I said before, fellowships can include what is called a stipend, or an amount paid to a fellow to aid in the pursuit of a fellow's study or research. Aid can be construed pretty widely here. Aid can mean that a student needs to be able to have housing to support their ability to do study or research. It can mean that they need to purchase equipment, need to purchase supplies. It can mean a variety of things, but it is not construed as compensation, but again, as something to assist them in the pursuit of the study or research. Stipends do not need to be limited. There's no specific cap on the amount of money that can be offered through a stipend. Now I'm going to talk about a specific subset of fellowships called inclusive fellowships. So again, fellowships can mean a variety of things that I've just said. We are going to concentrate on a type of fellowship that we are coining ourselves an inclusive fellowship, and that is a type of fellowship that is one that is accessible to fellowship that accessible to individuals regardless of immigration status. Again, to be clear, this is not all fellowships. This is a specific type of fellowship. And I would say actually the majority of fellowships that are out there are this type of fellowship, but it is not all fellowships. So fellowships do not require, sorry.
Sorry.
So they don't require recipients to have a social security number, a work authorization, or immigration status, and they're flexible mechanisms by which educational institutions can provide paid opportunities to individuals regardless of immigration status. So let's talk about the difference between non-exclusive and inclusive fellowships. So non-inclusive fellowships would require an individual to perform a past, present, or future service in order to receive payment. And that service is considered to be employment or work. And because it's considered to be employment or work, recipients would need to be authorized to work, and therefore would require a certain type of immigration status. Inclusive fellowships, which we are promoting here and supporting people in being able to construct, do not require the recipient to perform a past, present, or future service. They are not considered to be employment or work, and therefore recipients are not required to be work authorized or to have any specific type of immigration status. Many of you who are on college campuses are probably wondering about the difference between campus employment versus inclusive fellowships. So campus employment are things that would be considered work-study positions, student assistantships, lab aides, and those, I think as most of you know, are do require work authorization, and because they require work authorization, are not accessible to immigrants without legal status. Inclusive fellowships, on the other hand, again, do not require a recipient to perform a past, present, or future service. They're not considered to be employment or work, and they're not, their recipients are not required to be work authorized. So now I'm going to turn it over to Nancy, who's going to talk about some of our recommended guidelines for designing inclusive fellowships.
Thank you, Kathy. We want to talk a little bit about some of the guidelines of designing inclusive fellowships, because we found that with this work, it's really important to be able to actually have individuals think about what the components are going to be for the inclusive fellowship that they are trying to develop before they start to bring in different stakeholders, and have clear guidelines themselves before they start to speak to other individuals on their campus. So in terms of getting started, we really recommend that you adhere to the following guidelines, which are also included in the document of the fellowships for Ed. So I'm going to be speaking about grantors, and when we speak about the grantor, we're talking about the educational institution. That's in this presentation who are considered to be the grantor. So in terms of the guidelines, it's really important from the start that the fellowship is developed with the idea that there's going to be training, hands-on experiential learning, professional development, and networking opportunities built in to the very fabric of what the fellowship is that's going to be provided. It's also really important to be thinking about this from the start, that the relationship between the grantor, which is the educational institution, and the fellow really needs to resemble a trainer-trainee relationship or an advisee-advisor relationship, in contrast to an employer and an employee relationships. And what we mean by some of that is that grantors should not be setting set hours. It's not that this individual should be coming in between 9 to 5 to do specific work that's in a highly supervised way. Rather, in fact, it should be development of a project that will allow training, hands-on experiential learning, professional development, and networking to take place within a timetable that works for the fellow. Other guidelines that are really important is that the primary purpose of this fellowship is really to benefit the fellow's educational, professional growth, or training. It's not to benefit the grantor. So if there were the opportunity to be able to do research or have a study, the benefit that should really come out in the end should be greater to the fellow than it would be to the individual that was creating the research opportunity. So it's not a substitute for work. It really is looking at how can we build better educational and professional development opportunities for all students who are attending colleges and universities or high schools, or working within community-based organizations if you're thinking about the model of grants to individuals. In terms of thinking again about how grantors can offer stipends, the grantors can offer fellows to stipends, again, as Kathy was mentioning, as long as the stipends are not considered wages. Therefore, it's not like if you do X number of hours, we're going to give you a stipend. No, The stipend is actually to be able to create space in the fellow's life to dedicate the time and attention that's needed to be able to bring forward the kind of professional growth, receive the training, and strengthen their educational pathways through the fellowship model. Because these are not wages, then therefore the stipends do not need to be reported to the IRS in any form, including the 1099 form. And it's also because of that, because it's not wages, then the fellows do not need to provide the grantors with a W-9. So these are just important parts to be thinking about, to really be clear about, so that you can be prepared when you're speaking to other stakeholders on your campus about how you actually want to make sure that that information is shared.
Yeah, I just want to actually hone in on this point because I think it's something that people ask about quite frequently. People are aware that other mechanisms through which people are paid do require IRS reporting, and as you'll see on the guide, there is very specific information from the IRS on the 1099 form that indicates very clearly that fellowships do not require the grantor to submit a 1099. So if you look on the resource guide there, that link to the IRS form and the 1099 instructions is shared there.
Yeah, really important point. Thank you for highlighting that, Kathy. And also, I think we want to again give another shout out to Sam and also to Oscar from UC Irvine in terms of actually doing some of that research that gives the citations right there so that you can share those citations with your educational institutions as well. So it's not just like, I kind of think this, but you can actually go to the citation and help them gain a better understanding if they're not clear about those pieces up front. So once you have those ideas and those guidelines settled for yourself, then we actually have some step-by-step guides that we think would be important for you to actually create the opportunity and create fellowship, inclusive fellowships on your campus. And we've listed them out here. We give more details on the resource that was developed, but just in general, in terms of drafting a fellowship description, we think that that's important to really actually get something on paper that reflects the guidelines that we were just previously talking about, to have that be something that you can then share with stakeholders. Because it's really important that you get stakeholders on board and that they are aware of some of the information that's being shared and the questions that are going to come up. And some of the different stakeholders that you probably want to talk to would be faculty representatives who will be serving most potentially, or staff that would be serving as the advisor. Also really important to talk to representatives from human resources departments on your campus to make sure that there's clarity about that this is not a employment relationship, that this really is not about human resources, that this is much more around the educational and academic pursuits of the university. Also really important to talk about student affairs and get them to help be your champions, to help do some of that cross communication among departments, to have some of that buy-in be and address any questions that might have. Also really important to talk with financial aid individuals to kind of gain their understanding about stipends and follow any procedures that they might have for stipends to be awarded, and then really make sure that you're talking with student leaders. So those are just some of the many stakeholders that it's important to get on board, but we think that it's really good to try to draft your fellowship description, share that with your stakeholders, bring in the information that they have, and then you can finalize your fellowship description based on the stakeholder input. And that's really an important point in terms of really being able to get to the next step, which is creating the fellowship application process. So when you create the fellowship application process, what you're really doing is taking that description and turning it into an announcement. It's important also that when you're thinking about the fellowship application process, that it wants to be an open and competitive process, and that there are clear eligibility guidelines that are published, that there's an application timeline and a process. And that the reason that we think that it's really important to bring forward that application process is that you want to make sure that you're determining the eligibility of the applicant and matching that with the academic background and career goals with what the fellowship is actually going to undertake, so that you can make sure that those pieces are matching and that it's really going to go for the professional development and educational goals that individual students have. Once that part is done and you finalize the fellowship description and you've created your application process, then we think it's important to actually draft and publicize a fellowship announcement. And we'll be talking a little bit later about what some of those elements are, and we actually have Sam has drafted a fellowship announcement that we have within the guide that we are promoting, and we think that those should really explain the fellowship, invite individuals to participate in that, and should include different components like the stipend amount, the overview, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit more detail in the next slide. Once that publication of the announcement has taken place, then it really is important to do a fellowship selection process where you're reviewing the different submissions, you're determining that they actually meet the eligibility that you've set out. Follow-up interviews can actually be an important component to include so that you can get clarity about the applicant's interest and availability, and then make sure that the best fit has actually been met. And then once that has been done and you've said, okay, yes, we've gone through this and we've developed the person that we think that, or we've encountered the person we think that would be most helpful, then it's really important to draft a fellowship agreement. And just as an overview, although we'll be talking about this again a little bit later, is that it's really an informal notification of acceptance into the program. It's clarifying again that this is not a work relationship. It's demonstrating what some of the benefits will be, and then it's getting the proper signatures, right? Like that's really important. And then once that application has actually been drafted and approved by the institution or the grantor, then it's really important that the fellowship agreement, that you sit down and actually go through step by step with the fellow to make sure that they understand all of the elements, that you're both on the same page. And then once that's actually taken place, it's important to then make sure that the fellowship agreement is signed and that all the proper people get a copy of a fully signed agreement. And that way, there can just be, make sure that there's clarity across the board. Now, in terms of what we've developed these sample announcements, and I think that this is really helpful to actually see how to go from creating it to actually developing a sample, to developing an announcement and agreement for your fellowships. We have a sample fellowship announcement. This is just the first snippet of it that you'll see on our slides. And what really is important to include is an overview of what the fellowship is going to be, clearly demonstrate when the application deadline is, identify the stipend amount if there's going to be a stipend involved, and we certainly hope that that's possible to do. Talk a little bit about what the submission process is going to be, how they should submit it, clearly put out what the eligibility will be. Some common things like that is that they demonstrated interest in the field, be in good academic standing, and other areas that you think that might be important, and then really talk about what the description of the fellowship will be. So talking about what those pieces and elements will be, and then making sure that there's a point of contact so that if anybody has any questions, they can follow up. And you can actually look at the full sample agreement that we have as part of our guide, and this will be a great starting point for you to look at that, and then you can just go through and change all the contents so that the fellowship language actually reflects your specific fellowship and the elements that you have at your educational institution. Once the announcement is done and you've done the selection process, then you're drafting the sample fellowship agreement. We believe that these are really important elements that you should include. It's definitely important that there's a formal acceptance saying like we are offering this to you, we'd like you to accept it, having the name of the fellow and their contact information, beginning and end dates, what the terms are, as well as what the benefits to the fellowship will be. Also important to include some of the different liability and reporting requirements. Different schools want to make sure, we want to make sure again that this is clarifying that this is not a work relationship, therefore there will not be other benefits that will come in there. Some schools want to be talking about what kind of liability protections are there, so making sure that you actually accurately reflect that in your documents, and then going through any educational policies that the school is important, feels is important to put out, and then making sure that there's proper signatures. Of course, the grantor, the individual who will be the advisor will sign it, as well as the fellow, but there might be other people within your institution that it's important that they have sign off as well. And that's when you're talking to the stakeholders that you can get clarity about that point up front. So those are the main elements in terms of what we have, that the guidelines that we would put out to make sure that you have a good idea about how you can have a good understanding between inclusive, non-inclusive, why it is the tax reporting is not required, and then we've actually gone through the step-by-step guide for you to be able to create that and move along and develop those on your campus. Now, this is not a night-to-day kind of situation. It takes time in terms of bringing on the stakeholders, understanding it yourself, bringing in buy-in, and you're going to hear directly now. I'm so excited that we're actually going to be able to hear testimonies from a couple of different campuses. One, UC Irvine, who's actually very instrumental in helping us look through some of these guidelines and put that on. So I'm really excited now to be able to pass it over to Oscar and to Martha, who will be speaking in turn from the UC Irvine Dream Center. Oscar, take it away.
Thank you for the intro, Nancy. And it's a pleasure to talk to everyone. I'm really excited about this. Like Nancy said, this has been work that we've been doing for the past 2 years. And so this is kind of a culmination of a long process and the efforts and dedication of a lot of folks in this area. So a little bit about what we have at UCI. We have created a fellowship based on this inclusive fellowship model. We call it the Dream Project Fellowship. And the Dream Project Fellowship is really the culmination of about 2 years worth of work. And it will be launching this coming fall for us. But to get there, like I said, so many steps we sort of had to follow, some of which you've heard about in previous slides. The overview of our particular fellowship is that it offers a 1-year placement in a variety of different partner sites throughout campus. We've got departments and individuals all throughout our campus that are hosting fellows. Each one of those fellows will be there for a 1-year placement and receive a $1,200 scholarship per quarter, which totals $3,600 per year. We set the amount of that scholarship so that it would be equal to what a student employee would receive if they had that same opportunity at our average work-study wage. I wanted to make sure that there was economic parity there. The other thing that I kind of wanted to add was some of the process for us. You know, you heard outlined, I think, really well by Nancy, sort of the step-by-step that they recommend, and for the most part, our process followed that pretty closely. I would just throw in a couple of additional pieces that were unique to us. As we were going out and recruiting students and partners throughout campus to host students, we produced 2 FAQs that were just sort of like one-page flyers that we could give to folks. And it really helped answer the questions, because there's going to be a lot of questions. This is a huge paradigm shift, both for campus partners and also for students themselves, to think about these opportunities separate or apart from work, which is sort of what they most commonly would think of when they think of professional development. So those FAQs that we developed, those one-page handouts, were really important for us. And in addition to all of the work that went into developing the structure for this fellowship, for recruiting the students, for recruiting the placement sites, for matching them all together, the other important piece that we've worked on is the development of a professional development seminar. And this is a seminar that's going to be meeting every other week during the course of the year. So really, again, emphasizing that this whole experience is about the professional development and the learning of the individual student fellows. And we wanted to make sure that this built-in seminar component emphasized that learning goal. Also, one thing to add in the discussion of stakeholders, Nancy kind of, went through some of the important stakeholders to talk to. And in addition to the ones that were mentioned, we found it was really important to connect with our campus council in order to make sure that from a legal standpoint, they felt comfortable with what we were doing, that they had vetted what we were doing, and also to provide us with some institutional protection, because as we were going out and talking to different departments and individuals throughout campus and trying to sell them on this opportunity and ask for their participation, there were some folks that gave kind of pushback and had questions about what we were doing and if it was actually correct. And nothing shuts down those questions faster than being able to say, well, actually, the attorney for the university has already reviewed this program and has approved it. For us, it was incredibly helpful to have our campus council involved. And then finally, the last thing I'd like to sort of put in there was, when I think about the key lessons in our experience in getting this fellowship off of the ground, I do think that one of the biggest things that we had to contend with was just shifting the way people thought about these opportunities. When we presented this for the first time to a room full of representatives from different departments around campus, asking them to host fellows. They were thinking of this as work, and a lot of the questions they had revolved around, well, if someone doesn't have work authorization, how can we do this? How does this square with having, student employees in the same space, but this person isn't an employee? And so much of what we had to do was just shift the way they were thinking and really help them realize that what we were describing and what we had created was about providing learning opportunities. This is much more akin to an independent study than it is to anything involving work. And we just had to get folks to understand that this was an academic opportunity. This was a learning opportunity. This was not a work opportunity. So with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Martha Morales-Hernandez. Martha is the graduate fellow in the Dream Center and was hired actually specifically this past year to help with the administration, the management, and the creation of this program. And it's been a pleasure working with her. None of this would have happened without her work. None of this would have happened actually without Sam's work, who was previously a fellow at UCI when he was a law school student with us. So it's taken a whole team of people. And with that, I'll kick it over to Martha.
Thank you very much, Oscar, and thank you to everyone who has joined this webinar, and thank you for inviting us. I think to kind of just build off of Oscar's points, and before I get into that, I want to kind of acknowledge that a lot of this work was a result of a lot of student advocacy that made it a point to bring it to the attention of various different stakeholders on campus that this was an issue. And a lot of this work is really building off of their demand or their needs for to receive professional development. But I want to reiterate Oscar's point on the work. That one of the biggest challenge I would say is that we had to do a lot to deconstruct employment versus project. It was a concern that many different partner sites on campus described. In addition, there was a lot of concerns around HR, which is if, students were to work in a certain space, would they go through HR? Can they go through HR? All those were concerns that we had to kind of sit down and research and work with some folks in HR to kind of figure out how to best communicate it to people. And again, there was a lot of concern about, is this legally structurally sound, I guess? So talking to Sam and different people to kind of make sure we had all our bases covered was really important. We talked to folks at UCOP, we talked to folks at the campus council here at UCI that Oscar mentioned, and that really brought ease to a lot of individuals that were kind of on the fence on whether they would formally join as DPF partner sites or not. And so all those things are important to kind of make sure that you can answer all those questions and make them feel comfortable with that commitment. One thing I want to say about how we actually created the fellowship language, a lot of it was really just researching different fellowship and scholarship opportunities on campus. There are a lot of them at our universities, and they all use very, there are some that are very exclusive in that they're for a specific purpose, but a lot of the language is really inclusive in terms of forwarding a mission or something like that. And so that was a lot of what we did, was looking at these different calls for applications and seeing what language was used consistently and trying to mold that into our interests in terms of providing a fellowship that intentionally targeted professional development. We also did a lot of work on 209 to make sure we weren't breaking any diversity, legal, I guess, provisions in the university. And yeah, I'm seeing that there's questions coming in, and I just saw one right now. In terms of, is the fellowship only for upper division students? We really kept it inclusive to students of all levels, with the exception that students could not be graduating within the following year, just because of the fact that a lot of these scholarship stipends are getting processed through financial aid. So if students were not enrolled as full-time students, they weren't allowed to actually be a part of this DPF fellowship launch that we're having this upcoming year. But I'll leave it there. I don't know what other point to hit, but I don't know who's next.
Oh, well, really quick, Martha, I wanted to mention something about, you mentioned 209, and I think this is another good example of why it was helpful for us to partner with our campus council and to make sure that our legal research was really sound in this area. Proposition 209 is a California state law that, amongst other things, prohibits the distribution of financial aid resources in the state of California in public institutions on the basis of race, national origin, a couple of other classes of identity. And so initially there was some questions that folks had about, well, does this violate that state law? Does this kind of look like we're giving financial aid on the basis of maybe, national origin or something? And so that was a big part of why once we wrote up our fellowship description based on the research that we had done, we then gave it to our campus council, and they did really intensive research. I mean, their whole mission is to make sure that no action of the university is violating any of the applicable laws. And they spent a while with our work, and there was kind of some back and forth even with revisions of our language, but they were able to clear it, that we hadn't violated Prop 209, we hadn't violated any other state or federal law. And those, of course, were really important when we sat down with partners to let them know, look, we've done the work on this, and this is sound, and this is lawful, and here are the reasons why.
Thank you so much, Oscar and Martha, both of you. I think you bring up really important points. I have a couple of questions and some that have also come in as well. I was really excited to hear how you said, like once you've got your council on board, then it's really much easier to help get the other stakeholders on board. But what kind of information did you first bring? How did you engage them in this conversation? And what kind of advice would you give to other schools that might not already have, like direct connections to legal counsel, or how would you encourage them to be able to help them do the kind of necessary research to see that the research that you guys had already done or that a school might put forward is sound?
Thanks for the question, Nancy. In our particular case, we did provide campus council with a whole host of documents. And maybe one of the most important things that we provided them with when we first came to them was a series of legal research memos that had actually been done by Sam Park when he was a law school student at UCI Law. So we had actually commissioned Sam in his last year of law school to look into some of the definitions of employer, employee, fellowship definitions, and he produced 2 memos in these different topic areas. And that was the start of the legal research for us, making sure that we knew what the applicable rules were. In addition to that, like Martha mentioned, she worked on crafting a fellowship description that was based upon already active fellowships on campus. And so we saw what had worked, what had already been approved, and we took key language and structures from those descriptions when we crafted our own. And then finally, we had done a survey of other UC campuses throughout California, and we looked at what they were doing and if any had sort of tried to create programs that looked a little bit like this. And in fact, a lot of them had. And even though they weren't quite as robust as what we were proposing, and many of them were funded in different ways, sort of structured in different ways, there were a lot of good examples of folks that were already doing work out there. And we took those examples as proof that this can work and this is being utilized effectively. So that overview of other campuses, the legal research that had already been done on some of these topics with the citations to applicable rules and laws, and then a really sound fellowship description that was based upon already approved models.
That sounds really exciting and a very strong, powerful, argument's not the right word, but sort of like demonstration and research that's been done that you can share with your legal counsel. Did you also have the support of administrators on your campus? Like, where would you recommend that people kind of get started? Is it like talking to the vice president, talking to HR? Like, where would you encourage people to get started if they're just kind of coming to this anew?
For us, the 2 initial places where we got administrative support before we went to campus council, and really in some ways maybe our 2 key allies in terms of our administration, was with the head of the financial aid office, because fundamentally, this was about redirecting scholarship funds towards students regardless of work permit status. And so she was on board, and there was a lot of work that we did there to make sure that she understood what we wanted to do, that this furthered some of her goals and her own vision. And once she was on board, that was great. And then we also had the support of our Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs, who really saw this as furthering the mission that Student Affairs had taken on in the support of undocumented students on campus. And so those were two early key allies in our administration. And once we had them, it was a little bit easier for us to bring in other stakeholders. You know, as you mentioned, it's a pretty comprehensive list of people that you have to tap into, and a lot of knowledge and partnerships that you have to build across different departments on campus. But when we could cite you know, these two key figures as already on board, that made people, I think, a lot more inclined to talk to us and meet with us. And that coalition of support also, I think, was helpful when we sat down with Campus Council finally.
Hey, Oscar, this is Kathy. You know, one of the things that's been really exciting for us to hear about UCI's fellowships is the number of fellowships you're offering and the breadth of different departments that you have involved. We know that immigrant students are interested in so many different educational and career paths. And so the most valuable fellowships are going to be the ones that have the ability to engage a broad spectrum of people from different backgrounds and different training interests. So could you tell us a little bit about how you were able to involve so many different people from different areas of campus life?
Yes. So like Martha mentioned, we were really listening to students in the development of all of this. And when we were visioning what we wanted to create, it really came down to what students were saying they wanted. And students were very clear that they wanted opportunities in a variety of different departments and in a variety of different career paths. And so the other thing that we had to think about too, in sort of identifying a variety of different opportunities around campus, was how are we going to fund this? If this was something that was going to come out of, you know, the operating budget of the Dream Center, there was no way that we were going to be able to meet the scale of what students were asking for. And so what we decided on the model was to ask each individual placement site to actually fund the individual scholarship that their fellow received. And placement sites were really responsive to this once we went out recruiting people. Most places have money set aside typically for funding work-study students. That is money that could be redirected and used in another way for a scholarship, for a fellowship. And so that decision allowed us to make this scalable. So as many placement sites as we identified and signed up were as many spots available for students. The other thing that we did was we partnered with our campus Office of Inclusive Excellence. And they were the ones that actually sent out a campus-wide invitation. The head of the Office of Inclusive Excellence is the Vice Chancellor for that particular division. And again, I think having like a pretty highly situated administrator that was supportive of this was really helpful. In addition to that invitation from the Office of Inclusive Excellence, student leaders themselves had gone and met with individual deans of schools to let them know about how important this was. Many of them reached out to the deans of the schools that they were a part of. There was a sort of whole coalition of students that did this for months. And that was raising awareness at the highest levels in each individual academic school. And then once those two efforts had been made, we put out sort of the formal call to bring people on board. We did an information session where we invited people that had questions just to come and talk. We then did a sign-up period that was available to everyone on campus. And we ended up with a total of, Martha, correct me if I'm wrong, but 36 individual placement sites throughout campus that represent a variety of different disciplines, different departments, different career paths. And so we were really happy about that. Once you look at sort of the breadth of this, not only are we providing great opportunities for students in a variety of different areas, but we're also really helping to expand the network of allies that are out there. We are getting folks involved that have never been involved before, departments and schools involved that have never been involved in supporting undocumented students directly. And these are new folks that are invested in this, literally invested through the contributions that they're making into the scholarships and with the students that they're bringing on board. Another feature that we built in that I think is really important to that relationship with each placement site is that we are requiring that each one of the site mentors attend ally training this summer, so that for many of them, since it is the first time that they're going to be working with and supporting undocumented students, we want to make sure that they're trained up and that they're going to be effective allies. So we were able to do all of that, generate a tremendous amount of scholarship funds that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to generate. Over $136,000 was mobilized that's going to be received directly by students. And again, a really wide breadth of different types of experiences available.
Wow, congratulations, Oscar. Congratulations to UCI. Congratulations to the students and the advocacy to Martha as well, in terms of all the advocacy that took place to actually have this, be able to have such a wide breadth. I do want to also just let people know that are on the call that are not UCs or don't have a lot of institutional funds, that there are other ways. I like the way that Oscar highlighted. I mean, perhaps you were talking about institutional work study funds at the UCs that might have been able to be repurposed, but thinking if you're at a community college or if you're at a CSU, that you might be able to have student assistance funds or student lab funds or private grant funds that might be able to be redirected towards this, as well as if you're at the community college, equity funds that might be possible. So thinking about that, this is not something that's just for the UCs, although definitely really high kudos and excitement about the ability that you've done. Martha, I'd like to have you talk, if you could, just super briefly, because we want to make sure that we also have time for Rosa to talk about the model at the CSU. But I'm wondering if you just have some quick recommendations and you could talk a little bit about how are the best ways for student advocacy to work collectively with individuals who are allies on campus to be able to make the strongest impact and have the strongest ability to be able to create change, really letting the student voice be centered. And what advice would you have for educators that are listening on the webinar right now?
Thank you very much for your question. I think it was crucial to all this work, whether it was engaging with stakeholders and allies or direct students that are affected by all of this, is that there's a lot of time that goes into checking in with everyone. It's not the easiest thing. I'm not going to say that we're the best at it because, it is a lot of people to manage. But I think what I will recommend that people do is kind of finding a way to track every progression that you have in your work, and having that and finding a way to share it with all people involved or people that would like to see it. One of the strategies I think that we would do at the center in terms of listening to students is actually setting time apart from our regular check-ins between Oscar and myself to have students come in and kind of discuss what their concerns were and how they could kind of align their advocacy efforts with ours. Because students had a very particular agenda in terms of how they wanted to go about this, but through those conversations, we were able to find out that, students don't want to necessarily only be interns at the Dream Center. Not because they don't want to work at the Dream Center, they just want to do different, professional development opportunities that are in line with their disciplines. So students wanted to work on a project in a lab. They wanted to work on advocacy issues around race. There was just a variety of things. And so that really helped kind of contextualize where we sought support and where we actually decided to go talk to more, different partners on campus. Let's see. Besides that, I think one thing to always remember, I think when engaging with students, is that they do have this sense of urgency. And I think that urgency is important for everyone as a practitioner to keep in mind, but also finding a way to find common ground with them and letting them see that, universities unfortunately don't always move really fast. It takes time. And so I think that if there's a open communication where they're always being informed, we can kind of mend some of that. It doesn't always, I don't think everybody will necessarily be satisfied at all times with these conversations, but I think they're important to kind of communicate, to kind of set up a better relationship where we can all actively work towards the same goal instead of kind of, creating rifts in between. And also to remember that there's only so much we can do, but as long as we do what we need to, or as much as we can, then that is something to remember and to actively keep in mind.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And really helpful information that you shared. I'm also excited now that we're going to be able to hear from Rosa Salamanca from Sonoma State University. And also we want to remind you, please go ahead and put your questions in the chat box if you have them. Even if we're not able to answer all of those questions today, we do want to make sure that we're able to be aware of some of the questions that are coming up for you. So thank you so much, Rosa. We're really excited to hear about the model that Sonoma State developed.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this webinar. If you don't mind, can we move to the next slide? Well, thank you. As Nancy was mentioning, and as others have mentioned, Sonoma State also has a fellowship that is also inclusive for students regardless of their immigration status. Our fellowship is actually called the Aspire Fellowship, and it stands for Advancing Successful and Professional Immigrants Through Resilience and Education. And some of the things that I wanted to kind of mention and touch base with is at the beginning, when we started kind of wanting to create this, it was a little bit tough and it was a little bit kind of confusing. And I kind of see some of the questions that all of you are posting regarding trying to understand and grasp what fellowships are, the differences between internships and fellowships, and so forth and so on. So I think the first thing I wanted to mention is that I think from my personal experience that is sort of normal in the sense that you're kind of yourself trying to wonder and understanding what this is. So I think to be fair, I think you are at least making the first step into creating this kind of opportunity for students. For us, we sort of kind of started this program from scratch, but we also modeled a leadership scholarship that Cal Poly Pomona has. And this scholarship has actually been, the language in the scholarships has actually been also revised by the council at the chancellor's office. So we modeled the scholarship proposal. However, we knew that we couldn't do it as a scholarship. We knew that we wanted to do a fellowship. We knew, well, at this point, we didn't know that it was called a fellowship. We just knew that we wanted to provide professional opportunity for students, regardless of their status. We've also are one of the grantees for the Catalyst Fund, and we knew we had some of this funding to be able to kind of do this and didn't really know where to start. So we modeled the leadership scholarship that Cal Poly Pomona had. We communicated as well with other Dream Center staff just to kind of see what efforts they're putting on. One of the things that I found is that even if these other campuses don't have a fellowship, they might have a program where they create something that is kind of similar to what you might be trying to create. And that's kind of what we encounter ourselves with. So some of the process to create the fellowship, so it started with an idea. I think similar to a lot of you, our idea was how do we create opportunity for undocumented students, especially those that don't have a work permit. So we wanted to kind of figure that out. We obviously realized we couldn't have an employment opportunity, and we're trying to figure it out how to provide professional development for the students. So that was some of the things that I kind of started to talk to other coordinators and director from other universities and also community colleges as well to kind of see what are you doing, how are you kind of providing these for your students. And somebody that was really crucial to us was actually the Career Center staff on our campus, because there were pretty much the folks that I went to and talked to them and asked, what is a fellowship? What is the difference between a fellowship and a job? And how do we navigate this in the university? What are the things that you think we should be doing? What are the things that you see that are happening in private companies? And how do we kind of go about this? So those were some of the folks that we also talked about. Gladly, one of the things is my supervisor was on board with the idea of creating a fellowship since the beginning. So that was really helpful in knowing that I had the administrative support to be able to kind of move on and talk to other stakeholders on campus. After we kind of went through that process, we also talked to something that I found really important for us to do. I talked to departments on campus as well, and I asked them about the programs and how do they create these different programs. So how to, even though they were not exactly what I wanted to do, I wanted to know how they created it, who did they talk to, who was involved into this, and what was the process for them, because more or less it was going to be similar to what I was trying to do, in the sense that maybe I needed to talk to the same departments, maybe I needed to talk to the same folks to kind of go figure this process out. So we talked to the different departments on campus, and as I mentioned before, we also work closely with the Career Center to better understand what fellowships are. After that, that's when kind of at that point when I kind of had already figured out what a fellowship was and figured out, okay, we're doing a fellowship. This is what the program is going to be called. That's when we got a hand of the proposal that Cal Poly Pomona had used, and then we used that proposal to model our proposal. And Nancy was actually very crucial in helping us draft this proposal for Sonoma State and try to understand the languages and the terminology that we wanted to use. Once we kind of finished with that process, it was also, it went to my supervisor, it got approved by the different folks on campus. I needed to approve the fellowship and primarily communicated with the folks who manage our funding and also financial aid to also be able to create some sort of stipend process. Some of the stakeholders, that were really crucial for us was definitely my direct supervisor, trying to get the buy-in from him and the support from him. Also, the staff from the Career Center on campus, because they're mostly the ones who are kind of navigating this on campus, but also in the community. The Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, the Financial Aid Department, and also the Vice President of Student Affairs. So those are some of the ones that were crucial to us. And I think in general, the main two kind of categories of folks that I would kind of advise people to look into is definitely start probably with your supervisor if you already have that kind of relationship with them. And anybody else that is kind of responsible from the administrative perspective from any of the processes that you try to create. The second folks that I think are important, it's anybody who, whatever office it is that might be managing your fund, whether it is grants, university funds, wherever this money that you're going to be using to provide stipend for these students, I think that it's really important that you involve them in the process, because ultimately they're also going to be the ones kind of handling that financial component of that, and you also need to have a buy-in from them. They might not want to know necessarily too much about how to create the fellowship, what are the students going to be doing. They want to know kind of once you already have that, but they do need to be engaged in knowing how are we going to set up the stipends, how is this going to be processed, and how are we going to do this with the students. Some of the sticking points is that it was a slow process. Kind of, I think Martha brought up a really good point. There's a great need, and I think we all know that. And we see the students, and we hope that we can already have that opportunity for them. So it was kind of frustrating to just have a slow process for myself. I think it was also kind of frustrating it felt sort of a lonely process, even though it wasn't, because I had folks, especially Nancy, providing support and feedback, but it kind of felt like I was the only one in the university who kind of understood what I was doing. I had buy-in from folks, but I was kind of like, I guess, the mastermind behind that, and it can get a little bit overwhelming and frustrating. I think one of the other sticking points is definitely not understanding what fellowships are. I knew what fellowships were, but I didn't really comprehend them at the beginning. So kind of just understanding the differences between fellowships and employment. I think that was a little bit a sticking point. Some of our current model, initially we started with a semester-long fellowship. However, we are launching a year-long fellowship for next academic year. And students go through an application process, and they also go through an interview process so that we can choose the students that we think would best fit with the fellowship, and also that they can also benefit the most out of the program. Some of the main eligibility criteria is that the students have, for our purposes right now, that they have a California resident tuition application on file. They don't necessarily have to be one, but they have to have one on file. They also don't have to qualify for the California Dream Act or actually receive California Dream Act or FAFSA, but they do need to have an application on file at the very minimum. One of the other ones that as of right now is how it works for us as students. They're only able to kind of go through the program directly with the Dream Center, but in the long term, or hopefully not in the too long term, we're hoping that this is something similar to UCI, where we can collaborate with other departments on campus, so the students can also get those opportunities with other offices and not just our office directly. And some of the main kind of expectations that the fellows have for our program, it's to be an active participator in the fellowship. They also participate in weekly 3-hour trainings or meetings where we do a lot of a little bit more training, sometimes a little bit more hands-on activities to prepare them for the program. Students are also required to support program development and implementation, and they also do a final project at the end of the semester. At the end of the academic year, actually. Some of the key lessons that we have learned and that I would like to share with you is definitely ask folks on campus about how they went about anything they have created, especially those in student affairs. How did they create those opportunities? How did they do that? Who do they involve? Even if it's not particularly for undocumented students, I think it would be really good for you to know, this is the person that maybe I need to talk to about stipends. This might be the person that perhaps I need to talk to about professional development, and so forth. It will give you an idea of kind of putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Definitely remember, I think we have throughout the webinar, you have learned this is not employment, and we keep on saying that. And the lesson, I think that, or the advice that I would give is learn the different terminology. Don't use employment language when you're trying to have a fellowship, because it's not an employment. So make sure that you use the proper terminology and that you understand the differences between one and the other. So remember that it's not employment. Connect the needs and importance of your program to the success of the campus as well. A lot of our campuses tends to have the strategic priorities or a mission, a vision, or sort of something that this is what the university is really interested in tackling right now. Tie your fellowship description, your fellowship proposal to the needs and to the strategic priorities that your campus might be having. So how is this fellowship going to support what the university is interested on pursuing and doing? And use the language of, one of the things that I did is Sonoma State has in a strategic plans document. I went through that document, I read the document, I used a lot of the language they have to kind of justify why this fellowship was important. And lastly, engage your students in the process. Ask them why they think this is our opportunities that are important. Make sure that you ask for help. I think definitely ask for help and contact others, whether it might be Immigrants Rising, staff, or anyone else. Make sure that you're constantly asking for help and for clarity, especially if you don't have access to legal counsel. And if you have further questions, my email, it's in the slide, and feel free to reach out to me if you like.
Rosa, this is Kathy. That was such great information and advice. We definitely second your recommendation that people get comfortable with terminology. We found that's extremely important for people to understand the differences between internships, fellowships, scholarships. Sometimes people use those interchangeably without understanding that there are really legal differences between how those mechanisms work and what is accessible to students without work authorization or immigration status, and as well the term work versus employment versus training and learning opportunities. So it's so important that we all are very specific with the terminology we're using, and specifically in the context of fellowships, that we say fellowships, not scholarships, not internships, and that we say learning opportunity and placement, not job site or work. That's a wonderful point. I think it's also extremely important that people ask questions. So we get these terms wrong often, and if we're afraid to even ask questions or sort of talk about these issues, we will continue to use these terms wrong until we sort of talk out loud and talk amongst ourselves until we get really comfortable with these terms and the sort of ways that we can to make these work. So thank you so much for all your advice.
Yeah, thank you, Rosa. Thank you for sharing that information. It's really exciting to see that this is taking place at a CSU as well as at the UCs. A number of questions came up today about, is this also taking place at community colleges? Yes, it's taking place across the state, and we're really working hard to make sure that this can take place at more. So we will be sharing our information. We have been trying to do questions and answers along the way. We did take information from all the different questions that were answered, and we'll try to see how, if we didn't answer them today, that we can see how we can continue to work together to find the answers that we need. So as I said before, I want to thanks to all of you who participated. Thank you for staying past the 12 o'clock hour. Thank you for your work on your continued campuses, and we definitely encourage you to reach out, download our resources. Download our resource for educational institutions. There's also one specifically for private organizations, and we will be sharing this information to all who participated. So thank you again so much today. Thank you for all the work that you do, and from Immigrants Rising, we're signing off now. Have a great day.